So the main sort of reason for this evening and what we wanted to get across is that I mentioned, obviously, and it's no great news to anyone, we are in uncharted waters and uncertain times. And we chose manufacturing for this because actually, when you look at the history of the UK, manufacturing is always one of the most important things to keep running when the country is in trouble, when there is turmoil, whether that be actually producing goods that we need on a daily basis, producing goods that the emergency services are using, or even just the sort of logistics of getting things there. And we're acutely aware that there are particular issues for manufacturing when there is something like coronavirus. Obviously, there are areas that people still need to physically go into buildings, although I'm sure most of you will have workers that are now working from home. And where this really fits in with the cybercrime angle, and I'm going to hand over to Gary, who is very much the brains of the outfit, so I won't waffle on too much longer. But where we look at the cybercrime angle is that we know, as I expect you do, that a lot of people won't be watching their tellies with shock and horror at what's happening globally. They'll be looking at it very much with exploitative eyes and recognizing that this is a great opportunity to do significant damage to business and exploit a business because the circumstances that people are finding themselves in are so different. So hopefully that frames a little bit of why the topic is manufacturing and cybercrime and some of the issues. Gary, who introduced me, thank you Gary, is our professor of communicating cyber. He's certainly one of the most learned people I've met on the subject in all my years in the industry. And I'm sure that you'll find what he has to say this evening of real interest, hopefully importance. If you've got questions, please type them in and we'll pick up on those, or feel free to jump in and ask them. Just as a quick reminder for anyone that has joined, since Gary's mentioned, we are recording this, so from a GDPR point of view, you will be recorded asking a question. I think that covers everything. At the end, I'll just do a quick summing up of everything. But Gary, if I may, I'm going to hand over to you at this point.
Yeah, that's fine. No, thank you for that, Rob. I appreciate it. So I am going to talk to you for about 30 minutes or more about this topic, about cybercrime and how that impacts upon manufacturing. Certainly, with looking at some research that has taken place in the past, and why really we are in this perfect storm. Rob's done a very eloquent job there of positioning this in the world that we're living in now, which is we are living in uncertain times, and certainly the bad guys out there will think nothing of capitalizing on where the world is right here and right now. So that's really where we start the journey, really, is, we start off with this slide here talking about the perfect storm, but just by way of introduction, to me, I think it's important that, at least you understand who it is who's presenting to you. So in terms of my background, Rob kind of gave a view there of my job title, the Professor of Communicating Cyber, and that's a title that I've inherited, if you like, because of the amounts of talks that I do, writing that I do, be it either blogs or books, either participating on other blogs and webinars and such. But I've been involved in cybersecurity now for 20 years, 35 years actually in technology, but the last 20 of those very much working in cybersecurity, data protection, and doing lots of research as well with organizations into cybercrime, cyber terrorism, and the various different routes that the bad guys are taking into our organizations. More recently, I've been working with PhD students on cyber trauma and the evolution of crime and the use of artificial intelligence, or artificial criminal intelligence, ACI. So there's a lot of academic work that goes into what I do and what I talk about, but underlining that, and indeed, I guess, underlining Cyberfort, there's a lot of practical experience that we have as well that we bring to bear. So that's really just, by way of introduction to who I am. We've got a fairly full agenda, really. These topics, each one of these warrants its own presentation, all of its own, and I could talk about these for a fairly long time. So I promise I won't. I'm not going to take up your whole evening, but we are going to talk about the cybersecurity risks that businesses in manufacturing specifically need to be aware of. We are going to talk about the 3 things to help your business survive and thrive in these difficult times, and actions you should be taking today to get through this crisis. And Rob's already said he will summarize everything that we're talking about here and lead some questions at the very end. But I am going to start by saying that quite often when people start thinking about cybercrime and such, they start wondering, cyber attacks, start wondering about where the biggest risks are. It's quite a confusing landscape. It depends who you're talking to. But I actually believe, and again, based on speaking to criminals, cyber criminals, the bad guys, the hackers that are out there, about what they do and why they do it, I believe that the biggest risk that we actually have is that we're all potential victims of cybercrime. We can all become victims, and it's actually that our ignorance is their power. So ignorance is the biggest risk that we actually face. And that's the key message, really, that, if we can start to break through some of those complexities and we can arm ourselves with knowledge and information, then one, it makes the world a lot less scary. And also it puts us into the driving seat. It takes the power away from the bad guys. Because, and this is an important thing, because all too often when I speak to organizations in manufacturing as well as other sectors, one of the biggest fallacies that's out there is that cyber criminals aren't targeting me. That maybe, whether I'm talking to business leaders or business owners, I'm getting this message of, well, we're not a target. They're going after the banks, or they're only going after, the large financial institutions, or they're going after the airlines, or I'm just too small. Why would they come after me? And I promise you that the research that we've done, both academically and practically, that's not the case. You're not too big to be attacked. In actual fact, quite worryingly, a report back in 2016, this was reported that manufacturers suffer an increase in cyber attacks. And that you guys are just as likely to be attacked as anyone else. This report was actually based on an independent study, and in that study, they actually stated that manufacturing sector is now one of the most frequently hacked industries, second only to the healthcare, which I think is a fairly staggering fact. When I speak to manufacturers and they say, well, I don't really have time for this. I've got, runs to consider. I have practicalities. I don't have time to think about the hackers on the other side of the world. Why would they be coming after me? The actual, the research that was carried out was very exhaustive. It was expansive, and it looked at automotive, it looked at textile, it looked at electronic, and every other conceivable manufacturer that you could imagine was actually considered in this report. And essentially what they were saying is that threat actors are seeking to steal your intelligence, your IP, on any new products. They're looking at processes. They know that manufacturers are using aging systems and such. So they know that you are potentially a softer target. They're looking for designs, they're looking for confidential information. So all this information can be used by either themselves to either blackmail you, or they can use it to sell to adversaries or to your competitors and such. And this is just only increasing, you know, the attacks that we're seeing over recent years. We've seen the rise of destructive malware, such as NotPetya. We've seen in Destroyer, and of course, you know, WannaCry was one of the bigger ones as well. So we know that attacks are happening on the manufacturing sector on an increasing basis. This was reported back in 2016. Now, the difference is that we are living in a different world to 2016. Back in 2016, the Internet of Things was pretty much in its infancy. This is all the devices that we can connect to the Internet on the Internet of Things. In 2016, we were looking at in the region of around about 9 or 10 billion devices connected to the Internet of Things. By this year, estimates are, depending upon which survey you're reading, we're anywhere between 20 billion and 40 billion devices are connected to the Internet of Things. Or indeed, the Internet, the industrial Internet of Things, the IIoT, is what is now being framed. Smart infrastructure and industrial SCADA machines or systems. We're seeing small plants, large organizations, everything from textile, as it said, through to car manufacturing. All of these organizations now, these manufacturing plants, are being connected to the IIoT. So it's little wonder, really, that we're now seeing this evolution of cybercrime or crime. We're now into cybercrime, crime 2.0, if you like. The key message here is that the bad guys have recognized that as manufacturing plants have become highly mechanized, that they are actually becoming less and less observant to potential weaknesses in their infrastructure. We'll come on to what I mean by those weaknesses in a few moments. But when you consider that, again, back in 2016, when we were talking about that report that I mentioned earlier, that cybercrime was targeting energy industry on 41%. 41% of cyber attacks were targeting the energy industry and also other manufacturing sectors. So what you could think about with this is that almost half of all cybercrime is now looking at those manufacturing type businesses, of which obviously clearly yours is included. Included in this, of course, is a fairly recent attack. This was on Pills. Now, Pills is one of the largest producers of automation tools. Some of you may know of them. Now, on October the 13th last year, they actually had their systems down for more than 10 days after suffering a ransomware infection. And it hits all their servers and all their PC workstations across the world. This is a large German-based company, highly respected. They did all they could to recover their systems as quickly as they possibly could. But unfortunately, it still took their IT team 10 days. They actually suffered this attack, and it took them 3 days to get their systems or access back to their systems. So when we think about you as an organization, you may be thinking, well, you know, could we withstand that type of outage? Could you withstand not being able to access your emails for 3 days, 5 days, a week, longer than that? We've got to think about, when you're talking about ransomware infections, quite regularly, these aren't actually targeting one organization or another. Pills were just unlucky. There's a lot to that story, but they were just one of many kinds of organizations that were hit by the same type of ransom attack at that time. On their website, they talk about your projects being in a safe pair of hands. So safe hands, yes. But my question is, why weren't they prepared for this particular form of attack? Ransomware now is one of the largest and best known forms of attack that cybercriminals will use. It's one of their most regular attack vectors, if you like. And we need to start preparing ourselves because these things have been around for a long time. Again, another manufacturing story that some of you may have heard of, Stuxnet. Stuxnet was, this is something that happened 10 years ago, back in 2010, when the Iranian power plant was hacked. Now, Stuxnet was a virus. It still remains one of the largest and most successful industrial attacks in cyber history. And this was an allegedly state-sponsored weapon. And this Stuxnet worm, this virus, managed to infiltrate this Iranian power plant. And it took down 1/5 of the country's nuclear centrifuges and basically set its nuclear program back a decade. This was targeted, absolutely. At the time, it is well known, it's well documented that Stuxnet was a targeted attack. But the technology that enabled this to happen is now in the wild. And when we mean that, by that, we mean that Stuxnet code is used by other hackers and other cyber criminals to launch similar attacks on other infrastructure and manufacturing organizations. And that's one of the reasons why this is such a worrying post, because this was 10 years ago, and we know that this is happening. So the threats to manufacturing are just ever increasing. We know that machine malfunction, irreversible loss of strategic data, program wipeouts, pollution, tangible assets or economic loss, or even IP theft, as I mentioned several times. These are the threats. These are the reasons why the bad guys are, or rather the effects that can be felt from a threat actor getting into your systems, getting into your manufacturing plants and taking systems down. Now, why would they do that? And there's lots of reasons why they would do that. Financial gain. It could be because they are a competitor, and hackers for hire are now a thing. So you can actually, if you don't have the skills to take down your competitors, then you can hire somebody to do it for you. It might also be because of the type of organization that you are. It may be that you have that you are servicing a certain part of the world, the economy that perhaps the threat actors, the bad guys, don't like. So it could be ideology. It could be because of someone's beliefs that they decide that you are a target for them. So it's not always monetary led. So these, again, the important things to think about when you're thinking about some of the risks that to your business. It's not always about money. And sometimes it's just because you're there, you're collateral damage, and you were just caught in the web. There's a reason why it's called phishing. Sometimes you are just collateral damage. So why are you vulnerable? Well, the whole sector is vulnerable for a number of reasons. I've already mentioned it a couple of times, a lack of cybersecurity awareness at the board level, perhaps, or across the business, or the owner doesn't think that they could potentially or possibly be a target. So why bother investing in something that's never going to happen? We also know that people are vulnerable, you yourselves are vulnerable, especially now when you have a workforce that is being forced to work remotely, something that you may never ever have thought about before. So you may have your finance department finally safely working from home. Do they know about cybersecurity? Have they been warned about the potential threat of people ringing them? because now they can't just simply shout across the office to you and ask if everything's okay, or if that email that they've just received asking them to pay an order is real or not. So remote working and support is a real issue. And that lack of cybersecurity culture has led to insufficient separation of data networks and people not thinking really deeply enough about security across the plant, segregating the plant workforce to perhaps the office, the back office. The use of mobile devices and storage devices are obviously are being used more and more now. I already mentioned the IIoT, the Industrial Internet of Things. And this has increased the international data transfers as well. So no longer are you only a UK business, you are truly an international organization by the very nature of transferring data into certain parts of the cloud. Do you know where your data sits? And of course, the obvious one here around physical elements and attributes of a business like yours is the insufficient physical security, destruction of old equipment. That's something that we see quite often isn't really carried out in any structured way. Vulnerable software, software that hasn't been updated for some considerable time. We see control systems that are still running on out-of-date Windows 7 and Windows 8, even Windows XP, all these pieces of software which are now no longer supported, therefore not receiving up-to-date security patches. So your plant is, by its very nature, is now screaming out saying that we're not secure because we're using this piece of software. And it doesn't take much, it doesn't take very long for a cyber criminal just to do a pure scan of the internet to find out where these vulnerable systems are. And that really comes on to the penultimate vulnerability really, is the lack of vulnerability testing. If you're running vulnerable software, the first question you've got to ask is, well, how do I know? Well, you need to run a vulnerability testing, you need to check, you need to have someone to look at this for you. Now, that really comes back to this final one, which is this outdated and aging control systems. So we have a multitude of, if you like, the perfect storm. You have a infrastructure which potentially is vulnerable because it is leaking information. You have a threat actor who is happy and willing and ready to exploit you. So we need to do something. Question is, what can we do? Well, this brings us on to our second item. The 3 things to help you and your business survive and thrive. It doesn't have to be complex. If you think cybersecurity looks like this, or if somebody has told you it looks like this, then they're doing it wrong. Cybersecurity does not have to be complex. If you think of it like this, the National Cybersecurity Strategy for 2016 to 2021 has boiled it down to 3 things. Defend our infrastructures, our systems, our services, deter attackers and bad people from doing bad things, and develop our workforce so that they are better prepared to repel any kinds of attack. So if the National Cybersecurity Strategy can do it in 3 steps, then it really shouldn't be that complex for you either. And hopefully some of these steps that I'm going to take you through now will help with that. Because we've taken a similar approach within Cyberfort. We look at it as plans, people, and processes. So our vision, Andy Haig, who set up Cyberfort, his vision was a safer society by making cybersecurity easier to understand. And I think that's a laudable aim and vision. And I think that's, you know, something that we should be looking to work on. Have a good plan in place to address the risks and the issues. Understand it's about people and that you are there to protect people, and that you put processes in place to stop the bad guys from getting in. And again, there's a common theme within cybersecurity. We've talked about confidentiality, integrity, and availability for a very long time. So it doesn't have to be complex. And I'm going to take you on to now the final agenda item, which is these actions, that actually makes a little bit more pragmatic sense and practical steps that you can actually take as to help you prepare and get better at cybersecurity. So to get good at security, you need to focus on people, premises, policies, processes, PCs, and providers. It's not just all about IT. If we just focused on IT, then you're missing a big part of the cybersecurity story. You need to educate your people. You need to make sure that you're thinking about the physicality of security, that you need to have policies in place. And a policy is just a statement of truth. So it talks about what you will do to protect data. Processes, how you then protect that data, using your systems, and of course, making sure that you're using providers that you can trust. So if there's nothing else that you remember in this whole of this presentation, at least remember this one slide, because this is probably the most important of them all. But there are steps that you can take, and that's what I'm going to take you through now. So the first thing we always say is you cannot protect what you don't understand. So we always suggest that you perform a gap analysis. And it can go back to the previous slide where you're performing a gap in your knowledge and understanding around your systems. So we'll start there. So have we had a vulnerability test? Do we know how old the software is on those systems? Writing all these things down, asking yourself some very searching questions is really important. And this is getting that gap analysis, that, minding the gaps in your thinking and your understanding, because it's between those gaps that the bad guys will sneak in. So you may have got the best IT systems in place, but when we perform gap analysis and we ask people these questions, we often then find out that they haven't trained their people. So if your people haven't been trained, but you've got great IT systems, then you still have a gap. So you now need to close that gap, train your people. So minding the gap, really having to think about what are those difficult questions, those searching questions that you should be asking. And let's be honest, we're all probably working remotely right now. We've probably got gaps in our diaries. So mind the gap in your diaries and start to plug those with some strategic thinking. Get your leadership involved. Get your management team into one place on a Zoom call or a Teams or whatever platform you wish, and ask them those strategic questions about what you're doing to protect the data that you guys have access to and the actual physicality of your business, so you can keep your operations moving forward. Thinking about the leadership and strategy is, again, really coming up with ideas around what budget you might think you need, what is your vision ultimately, what are you trying to achieve? You don't have to become Fort Knox, you don't have to become the Bank of England, but what you do have to do is take appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect you, your business, and the people who work for you. The next step I would always advise you to do is perform some form of risk management and assessment. And this doesn't mean that you are just looking at, again, the health and safety risks. So these are things that are probably, risk management is probably something that is very high up on your agenda. But thinking about the technical side of things, what would happen if you couldn't get your operations back up and running in the next 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks? What happens if you are hit with ransomware that now ties up your entire manufacturing plant or your finance systems? Could you actually continue to operate? And remember, there's no such thing as 100% secure. Even as a cybersecurity consultancy, I'm sure you probably would like us to tell you that there is. Unfortunately, there isn't. There's always a risk. If you are being targeted by someone, it's a little bit like the difference between being targeted by a ninja as you walk down the streets, or being targeted by your everyday thug. One of these you can repel, one of these you can protect yourself against, the other not so much. So you have to do your own risk assessment, understand where your risks are, and then train your people. It doesn't have to cost a fortune to train people. Yes, you can do PowerPoint presentations. Yes, you can buy software, but the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, does some great posters. They do some great resources. There's lots of free resources out there. So seek them out. Whilst you've got this time, train your people, because I absolutely guarantee, and we're seeing this already, that the bad guys are far in advance of this current crisis in terms of looking for ways to exploit this dispersed workforce. Increases in phishing emails, increasing in SMS, smishing, as it's called, SMS messages coming through to your phones saying this is, you know, tax relief for your business, or coronavirus, hand sanitizer, 100% protection to your family. All of these things we're seeing coming through from the bad guys. They are way ahead of us, and we need to make sure that we actually get in front of them. And it is about getting in front of them. This is not a state of a line in the sand. This is a journey. It's not a destination. You have to keep on working on this, this program of improvement. There's lots of standards out there that can help you. Everything starting from Cyber Essentials at the very bottom of this journey, all the way through to ISO 27001, which is an international standard for security, to 7701, which is an international standard for personal information management. And even for your own industry, there is something called the Nist Cybersecurity Framework for Manufacturing. You can Google all these terms, you can take a look at them. You could use these as the basis of your gap analysis. So if you need to really focus down and start to understand these things, there are frameworks out there that you can follow and that will help you on this journey. It really doesn't have to be complicated. Know your gaps, be strategic, know your risks, train your people, and start the journey. That is my presentation. I hope you found that useful. Thank you for your attention, and I will hand over to Rob now. If there are any questions, Rob, I'll be happy to take them either from the people on the call or any that people have sent in.
Gary, that was excellent. Thank you very much. I think quite thought-provoking, and on the face of it, there is a lot of work. But as you said, it's a process, and like any process, if you follow it, hopefully it's not too painful a thing. I do have some questions that have come in. Unless anyone wants to interject, I'll ask the first question. No takers? Okay. So the first question I've got is from Mike. And Mike says, are we already seeing a rise in attacks since the emergence of COVID-19?
Yes.
Okay.
We're action fraud. If there is a cyber attack of any significance, there are groups that are doing research around this area, and action fraud is actually a great place to get data from in terms of what's happening. And we're already seeing a whole new strain of phishing attacks, as I've already mentioned. But yes, we're already starting to see that come through. What those numbers are at this point in time, it's not, they're not concrete, because again, the problem with cybercrime and reporting figures, they are historically low, but anecdotally, we are seeing that increase, yes.
Okay, thanks for that. Question from Matt. How do homeowners impact my GDPR compliance? Home workers, I think.
Home workers,
yeah.
That's a great question. Well, GDPR compliance home workers, you've got people working in their home, and I'm going to use these, inverted commas, office, and that office is not controlled. So that office that they have is likely to be, it's likely to be insecure. There'll be other people in that room who will have access to the information that you have on your screen or on people's screens. If they have a printer, if they do have an office at home, they may have a printer, but it's unlikely that they will have a shredder to be able to erase the hard copies of documents and such. I'm also, again, aware of organisations who have rushed in their contingency plans and processes and have sent people home, and I quote, ask them to use to commandeer their children's laptops. So they're using home PCs that probably aren't protected with up-to-date software and malware protection for business-related topics and work. So there's lots of different data breaches or potential for data breaches that are now occurring.
Okay. The next question I've got actually segues into that quite nicely. It's from Javid, and he says, how can I mitigate risks with home workers?
That comes back to the question I mentioned earlier, which is, or the point I made earlier, is about training your staff. And this goes back to another point, which is about having policies. Having policies in place, they don't have to be draconian, but they can be such as, do not use non-work hardware and devices to perform, work on our behalf. Don't transfer data without validating that it's safe to do so using encrypted links. So you can offer, advice and guidance through a policy, and then educate your staff on that safe working from home. Until we had the lockdown, I was seeing and hearing lots of people saying, well, I'm not going to travel to London, or I'm not going to travel to these hotspots, but I'm going to work from the local cafe. I'm going to work from this location. And, again, you think, well, that's fine if you've got a mindset which is cyber related, cyber secure related, but lots of people are sat in insecure locations using free Wi-Fi, which we know is inherently risky. So educate your staff, give them clear policies and processes to follow.
So I guess really one of the messages there, Gary, is that, for a lot of businesses that are really doing this on the fly because they probably didn't have a contingency plan for everyone to work from home quickly, is that they really need to engage with an organisation such as ourselves pretty smartly to make sure they're doing the right things in the right way, yeah?
Yeah, I would say so. I'm just, apologies, my screen just switched itself into sleep mode. But yeah, I think the problem is that we've got a lot of people that are working who have never worked from home before. And in those situations, given that situation, they've never worked from home. So all of a sudden they are presenting risks to their business, which, they don't mean to do it. It's not intentional. It's all in goodwill, and they're there to try and support the business as best as they possibly can. And it's really just down to the employer. It's down to us really to make sure that what we're doing is making sure that they are protected and that we are doing the right things. By giving them the tools that they need, and importantly the knowledge that they need as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Excuse me. Final question I've got here, unless there are any others, it's an IoT question, I think. It's from John, and he's saying, how vulnerable are SCADA machines, and is that an area that we can help with?
Right, okay. It's that's a big question. So SCADA machines are vulnerable because, again, they have very many moving parts. They are historically attached to older systems and networks and such. Can we help with that? Yes, because it's about testing of those. It's vulnerability testing. It's assessing to see if those systems are indeed up to date. And if they are up to date, how well have they been coded? How well have they been maintained? So that comes down to gap analysis and to technical vulnerability assessments. But SCADA I did a talk a couple of years ago over in Geneva at a large convention of national infrastructure. And one of the big concerns they had there was the SCADA network controlling the heating and energy networks. And they were concerned about the devices we were putting into our homes, which were connected to the central systems. And that's because suddenly the attack vector, the attack surface rather, has just went from a few hundred machines connected to the SCADA to several millions. So it's the broad range of the SCADA, which I think is our biggest risk. So is it vulnerable? Yes, inherently. Is a particular SCADA system within one particular sector more vulnerable than another? It's difficult to say, but certainly we can help in terms of those testing, that vulnerability testing and code testing and gap analysis. Yeah.
Excellent. That's all the questions I've got. I can't see any others that have popped up. No. So with that, I'm going to say, Gary, thank you very, very much for what has, I believe, been a very informative and very interesting conversation.